Hi everyone, welcome to round four of the USUDC lecture series. I'm XK, I use they them pronouns. I'll be doing a PM on the motion of opposing African elites outsourcing ambitions to elites. Tane is going to give an LO next, and then we'll talk about the motion in detail, explaining what CG/CO arguments are out there, as well as the general strategic approach to debating this well. When the shock therapy that Jeffrey Sachs would revitalize African economies failed, leading to joblessness and suffering, his reaction wasn't to have a lot of regret and to say that what he did was wrong, but rather to say that this had worked in Europe in the past and that the real problem lay with African countries themselves. The problem with outsiders is no matter how much control and ownership you give them, they still just are projects to them. They're fungible and they're interchangeable. On the other hand, keeping it in-house and making sure that African people are in control of African development means that there's a strong incentive to have it succeed and prosper in the long term. Three arguments from side government today. First, on why on an immediate level, African elites are just generally better at making choices as opposed to consulting from outsiders. Second of all, on why this is better at creating growth in the long term. And finally, just addressing some op material on democracy and autocracy and explaining why even on this ground, OG is ahead. Before that, a couple points to set up. First, this is about a norm. It's not about this happening in every single instance, but we do think that there's an expectation and unspoken agreements that affect countries who, despite that. And number two, the general context of when African elites have outsourced ambitions in the past has often been in the context of asking for loans or conferences with the IMF in the past. We do think that China maybe is part of the debate as well, but it's probably a little less so because historically it's just been much less interested and setting targets for like literacy, for example, and just been much more literacy involved. So the heart of the debate really is about Western new colonialism and about African relationships with the EU and the USA. First argument then on why this decision making is much, much worse when you are outsourcing your ambitions to outsiders and allowing them to set targets and long-term goals for your development initiatives. So the first thing, I just want to be clear about how exactly this is happening. Oftentimes you have IMF bankers, elites, academics who are coming in and consulting for countries and saying, hey, this is what you should be aiming for the next 10, 20, 30 years. But other times it's conditional and tied to a particular like loan, where if you're borrowing money from someone, like you also agree to set these targets for the future as well. The reason why this is so bad is for three main reasons. The first reason is there's a fundamental misalignment in the priorities and the mentality that a lot of Western thinkers have in terms of development compared to what is necessary on the ground in Africa, which means that there's a chronic under expectation for African development. So, for example, like when there was an IMF loan proposed to Liberia for a highway, there was a general proposal to do 4 lanes because we expected the population to grow. But the response we got was, well, there isn't really demand to justify that right now, so let's just stick to two. And just 5 years later, that road became totally overwhelmed and congested because people obviously then started having more kids, the cities became larger as well. And I think that's a great example of how the frameworks that are used to justify cost by projecting like profit, for example, often fail when they're exported to Africa without really considering the context there. The second main thing to consider is that there's just a lot of plain old racism where there's an expectation that a lot of these projects will end up running into roadblocks that are insurmountable. And oftentimes there's an acknowledgement of past obstacles on both sides of the house. But this is exaggerated to a much larger extent with foreign elites who are primarily exposed to this through academic and other like kind of influences. We do think that a lot of this times it's like dressed up as wokeness, where it's a description of how projects have failed in Africa in the past because of imperialism. But even then, there's an expectation that projects fail and that for those reasons we ought to aim low. The third main thing to observe is that you also just oftentimes have development initiatives and promises that aren't concerned with growth at all and really just want to secure resources, for example, and want collateral. And the reason for this is because even if individual people want a project to succeed, they're often subject to goals by higher ups to guarantee an X% return, for example, or to at least say that we're able to like achieve our goals to 80%, which is why they chronically underestimate. So the end impact of this is that allowing outsiders to set goals leads to goals that are ultimately not going to give you the capacity that you need to grow in the long term. On the other hand, we think that African elites are much better at making these choices. One, because they obviously have the better information than the problems that I've just described, but two, because we think that frankly, they have spent much more time in these contexts where they have where they are going to be tied to this for the next 10, 15, 20 years. They're highly accountable. They have fixed problems when they're coming up. The impact of this argument overall is that we would honestly prefer for there to be some instances where we overreach and set goals that can't be fulfilled than for us to have this chronic system where Westerners come and impose goals that are nearly not nearly as ambitious as we would like. And the main reason for this is because a lot of these goals, when you fall short, can be compensated for when you extend the timeline of the project, for example. But number two, because you see clear gaps in capabilities as a result of projects fading, and that directs future investment in really helpful and efficient ways as well. On the other hand, when your starting point is too low to begin with, then you learn nothing, you're highly complacent, and you never get the lift that you need to really help people develop better lives. Second main argument then is on growth in the long term. And this argument's really focused on the talent problem that a lot of African development is facing, where because a lot of the key decisions are made by outsiders, so like you have this idea for a dam, but instead of really consulting your own universities, you have Oxford University come in with a study as to like how you should do this. And this is often something that means that people either think, A, there's no point to trying to add to agitate strongly internally and to ask the politicians to do things because ultimately it's going to be a random white guy who makes the call instead. But number two, it also means that young people who are extremely talented and want to make a change think that going to the IMF or going to a foreign country and then coming back to help is the real way to solve your country's problems. Issue though is that that often doesn't work. The golden handcuffs thing means that when you leave the country, you often just find that you have roots elsewhere in a Western country because quality of life might be higher because you become comfortable there. But number two, because once you enter Western university, oftentimes the classes that you take mean that you're also detached to some extent from your homeland. So what we would strongly prefer then is to have a development model where we are giving African elites a chance to make core decisions on a much more regular basis. And that's what's going to create a virtuous cycle that means that we have leaders who are able to attract more investment, attract better decision making, and create this long-term growth. Final argument then is just on democracy, and the claim here is simple. The biggest threat to African democracy isn't leaders deciding that they no longer interested in growth and want to now like take money, become autocrats suddenly, but rather coups. The military coups that have overthrown democracy after democracy in the past year alone indicates that frustration at Western imperialism and interference is what's really motivating people to really just protest and to take power militarily and go off on a completely different tangent. Our claim generally is that regardless of whether decisions are made well or not, the fact that they're made in-house by an African means that there's much more accountability, there's much more willingness to wait and see, and there's more of a chance for democratic checks and balances to come into play.
Hi everyone, I'm Tane. I use he, him pronouns, and I'll be giving an LO for this round. And then we'll kind of have a conversation, like XK mentioned, on some of the closing arguments and additional strategy notes about the motion. Before I begin, I think that there is a big conflation in the Prime Minister's speech about what this round is about, because development is not one amalgam, but rather something that occurs in phases. The entire Prime Minister's speech takes all three phases of development and treats them as if they were one. That is, the idea of setting targets that you work towards, the idea of strategically thinking about a project, and the idea of executing a project are all fundamentally different. We fully agree with the Prime Minister that the second and third phases should definitely be things that are done in-house. But this round, unfortunately for the Prime Minister, is about the first. How do we set goals and actually get an agenda that moves towards these things to begin with? But secondarily, I think that there's a problem with the world that is set up in the Prime Minister's house, which is it's extremely unclear to me that the external goals that are set are those that are overly ambitious. In fact, we think that the opposite is more likely to be true. They're going to be overly prescriptive. They're going to have you adhere to Western standards of things being done because we agree that it's largely about the EU, the UN, and the US, organizations where the West does have outsized influence. So I want to be very clear. They're likely going to push countries in ways that aren't sustainable and aren't the best fit. But what we would argue is that that is better than the goals not being set because that is the comparative. Understand that in a lot of the countries that we are talking about, goals are not immediate priorities. And the reason for this is a fewfold. First, there's weak institutional enshrinement. That is, that if there were a very, very stable rule of law and a high level of economic sustainability and an engine for development, they wouldn't be in needing these goals in like heavy development to begin with. But the problems under institutional enshrinement are a fewfold. That is, it includes things like legal capture occurring, or things like opposing factions and parties often making sure that the actual incentives for development never actually end up occurring. This means that in the best case on government, what they end up with without the outsider's influence is vague pushes that often don't lead to the desired outcomes. So you get promises towards things like you did in the early 2000s with the Millennium Development Goals, where people said that they would do things in certain ways, but it wasn't until the revamp, until we get the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, that people actually talked to leaders within Africa and worked with Western institutions to actually see meaningful change on the ground. Three arguments then under this frame. First, you get better accountability mechanisms for the leaders in these countries. That is, right now, we have a situation where people promise to do something, but there's a lot of incentives that exist on the ground to kick the can down the road. First, the political costs are very high in the short term. That is, a lot of these development mechanisms are one, things that have high social and cultural costs or high levels of economic costs. But secondly, there's this general inertia. That is, even if those costs don't exist, the incentive to agitate is not something that politicians, especially those trying to accrue power in many of these countries, want to actually take on. But thirdly, there's also a general resistance to influencing a change within the culture. But I want to be clear. It doesn't mean that we're actually going to get this change to begin with, but it means that it is easier to hold people accountable. That is, that if you get someone to agree to a certain target that is prescribed by an outsider, even if it is one that is unattainable, that is okay. Because there's two things that likely happen. First, you get incremental change. That is, that even if you make it 20% or 40% or 60% of the way of a goal, it is an easy way for a leader to say that progress is being made and an easy way to show accountability to your Western partners. But secondly, if you don't make that change or things regress, it is easy then for institutions within the country to hold you accountable for those promises. Understand the counterfactual. The vague pushes mean that accountability is much more difficult and much more harder to actually get. Secondly, we think you're better at actually achieving end goals. That is, that we change the risk calculus for individual people on our side of the house. When you have people actually setting targets and goals in place, what you actually do is that you lower the actual cost to engage in these sorts of activities. The first reason is that there is now an accountability mechanism, which means the cost of doing nothing suddenly becomes much, much higher. But secondly, understand that the way that this manifests is not one that you're fully on your own. That is, these agreements come with very high levels of visibility. So, for example, when you have massive literacy initiatives across Africa, it's not that governments are left to do this on their own, but there's tons of organizations that come in and think about how they can actually help. And these organizations are both internal and external. We can have a debate about whether or not it is better for these to be exclusively internal or exclusively external or a mix of the both. But at the end of the day, any progress towards these goals is extremely, extremely important. And the only way that you actually get that is on our side of the house. The reason for that is in the framing at the top. Remember, if you don't get these things set on an agenda that people are working towards, it never remains top of mind for individual people. But I want to characterize that there's also a capacity issue on side government. That is, that even if everything that they say is true, the problem on government is they never prove that there is the ability to do this in a way that is sustainable. That is, the countries that are most likely in need of these sorts of goals and assistance in terms of development actually have the ability to do this organically on their own. So it's up to the Deputy Prime Minister to show us that there is actually a pathway to meaningful development that occurs on their side of the house, not just lip service that shames the West for goals that they are trying to push. No one's saying that the West is a perfect actor, but if they're a catalyst towards progress, that's something that we can accept on our side of the house. The final thing then is on global inclusion. And the greatest failure for African countries and nascent democracies all across the world is that there is no pathway in a lot of cases to global inclusion. When people are given goals to build in isolation, and when people do things in an internal manner, you see that there is very little incentive and capacity for external actors to engage. This is why, for example, the large number of countries that develop with isolationist economies and political systems with high levels of tariffs and limited interaction with the global system often end up being the ones that are the most autocratic and the highest level of crackdown with the least visibility and transparency for external actors. What we tell you is that this allows you to serve as a material prerequisite for global engagement. That is, that these goals do not exist in a vacuum, and they are not simply meant to push a country in a general direction, but they allow countries to say, look, if you make progress in a certain way, we can engage in partnership with you because the incentive of a lot of these external actors is to make sure that they're creating partners that they want to work with in the long term. If countries are able to signal that they're making progress in these ways, they're able to unlock massive things such as conditional investment and conditional political settlement within these countries and actually create partnerships that will give them a pathway to sustainable development in the long term. This round is not about perfection. This round is about incremental progress. We are the only side that gives these nations a shot of sustainable development, and we're extremely proud to oppose.
Okay, so we'll first talk about strategy for Gov and Op, and then talk about extensions for Gov and Op. On Gov strategy, I think the interesting thing about this debate is that there seem to be a couple of really core clashes about decision making and also about growth and development in the long run. But there are like 1,000 different ways to approach those clashes, especially because it's not clear what the direction of outsourcing is. So we both ended up claiming that this debate revolves around Western actors. That's not necessarily true, especially because obviously like recent events like USA going means that the state of the world is rapidly changing. All of that is to say that one really important piece of Gov strategy is to frame really clearly from the get-go about who you think this is about, and then secondarily to come in with deputy framing that crosses the floor onto the other side of the house to be like, okay, let's consider the other scenarios as well after we've already buttressed our case and then won in like the majority of instances.
Yeah, on op strategy, I think that it's also very, very framing heavy. I think that it's very easy in this round for a lot of people's initial thoughts to be, that op is in a position where you're defending Western intervention in these countries. And I think that it's really important to think about exactly what it is you're defending, and then what the counterfactual is. So, what I spent a lot of time in my speech doing is kind of shaping what that counterfactual is likely to look like, and place setting the debate very specifically in the countries that it's likely to occur in. I think the other thing on op strategy is to kind of walk through the timeline, and then think about the different types of impacts that you can see. Because it's not just is this kind of involvement generally good or bad. It can vary a lot in terms of how the actors are interacting. It can vary a lot based on the time scale if you're thinking about more short term, medium term, or long term.
In terms of extensions, the first one is I think that there is a lot of room for vertical extension coming from CG. So what I did in my PM was to kind of get at a directional kind of argument where maybe Western institutions influence a goal setting in a way that is unsustainable, sorry, that is like not ambitious enough and which curtails and caps growth, or might actively be counterproductive because it's motivated by other things. And by making a claim that African leaders have the capacity, but also this increases the incentive for them to put energy into these development efforts in the long run. So there's a general direction to it, and there's a little bit of gesturing at what these projects might look like and why they matter, and like stuff on like iterating on processes. But a lot of that is very, very high level. So there are a lot of ways in which you could make this more granular depending on what DPM says. One of them is being really specific about the particular types of projects and deals that are happening, and to explain why in those contexts, like what difference does it make if you're doing it in-house as opposed to outsourcing. And also, number two, talking about the degree of benefit that you get. So doing a lot of scaling as to what, like charitably, here's what the best case on op looks like, and here's why we on CG are proving a really strong margin. And the third thing is to connect the directional material that's a starting point from OG to then go much, much further and explain why this accumulates into sustainable long-term virtuous growth in a variety of different ways. So there's a lot of room to expand on fundamental OG ground. Second main thing is I think that there were other arguments that can be developed. I gestured at one of them in my speech when I talked about democracy and about coups and about why removing external influence from core decision making is essential for maintaining political stability. But there's definitely a bit more you can do to this argument in terms of explaining why this is a unique factor that causes the pendulum to shift in the majority of cases. So, like, why is this the specific thing that is going to stop coups from happening in like X number of cases? But then you can also talk about IR. Like, how is this going to shift relationships with the West, with China, which actor is better, and then expanding the debate into that ground as well. Um, and the final thing that you can do is just really cross the floor and accept a lot of the worst case scenario material coming from op. So I think the strongest challenge by far coming from OO is the idea that the comparative isn't worse Western like goal setting, but rather almost like no sense of direction to aid whatsoever. And that's probably like not the most charitable ground in the debate, but it is the strongest push that op can give. So what you can do from CG is to bite that bullet really hard and say, our opening was dependent on this like idealistic vision of how growth can occur once you just keep more Africans in the decision-making process. Here's why, even if we take on ops much higher burden and say that maybe doesn't happen, why the destructive power of outsourcing to external actors is so detrimental that it alone is enough to justify our win. So they're just three examples of extensions of the debate, but I think it's generally very broad, and there's a lot of room for teams to take it in whatever direction they desire.
Yeah. I honestly think that a lot of the extensions on op are kind of follow a similar pattern to the ones on gov. I will note that there's, a couple things that I flagged but didn't really complete as arguments on gov that I think are definitely, or on op that are definitely rooms for extension. So first is, I briefly mentioned about the pace of development, but I think there's a lot of ground there for CO to come in and talk about why pushing the pace on development specifically is a good thing. I think there's a lot of argumentation on how that changes development, who starts doing it, what the incentives of various actors are when you start developing more quickly. Secondly, I think that almost every argument on OO can be vertically extended on in terms of giving more mechanisms on how it actually happens. So, for example, I think this is most true of the third argument around global inclusion, where we talk about these goals are often like a prerequisite to certain types of things. I flag conditional investment and, political relationships, but I think there's a lot more work to do there, right? Because obviously investment can come in for a number of reasons. I think CO can prove why often like investment is hung on these specific goals, why they're used as cover to begin entering countries. I think there's a lot of characterization that can be done there. The third thing kind of relates to what XK mentioned, which is, in the LO that I gave, I definitely pushed a pretty negative version of the Gov world. I think that you can definitely spend a lot of time comparing to a better case on Gov. So even if they are able to set goals, what do those goals look like and why are they still insufficient? That would be likely something that happens in a deputy, at least partially, but there's probably room there, especially if the deputy doesn't go for it. The last piece that comes to mind immediately is kind of what your partnerships look like. And this is kind of similar to what XK mentioned at the end for Gov, but it's also true on Op. That is, if you are, working with someone to set these goals, how does this change your alliances and the signals that it sets to other people? But also, when you work with certain organizations, how are those organizations likely to come in? So, for example, like the LO case of you can get goals set, but then you're not likely to have, these other organizations come in is maybe like not entirely true because it's kind of just like asserted that these are separate processes. I think that CO can again, in a way take a more charitable gov approach and say, if you do set these goals with Western organizations, it's likely they'll be involved in the development, and you can talk a little bit more about why that involvement is likely to be positive and kind of turn a lot of the OG material.
Okay, thanks everyone, and hope you enjoyed the round.